In this video, we're going to look at a game between Anish Giri and Magnus Carlsen from the Meltwater Chess Tour Finals. In this game, Anish is playing the white pieces, and this is one of the coolest openings I've ever seen. This is a really nice game. Alright, so we start out with a Sicilian defense Rosalimo attack. This is what Magnus tends to play as white, but in this position, Magnus is playing the black side. And here we're still following theory. We can look at the Lee Chess database for masters, 4,000 games. d4, c takes d, knight takes d, queen b6. Now at this point, knight takes c6 was played 180 times out of 191. But there's also something where the players are probably thinking about like who can out-prep who can surprise the opponent. And I think here, Anish had this line prepared, bishop e3, which is sacrificing a piece. After knight takes d4, a4, Magnus has 4 pieces on the board to Anish's 3. But the knight on d4 is pinned. So in the game, well, first let's show what move makes the most sense. Pawn to e5. Let's defend this knight. Now if c3 is played, we can play a6. And I think this is what Anish probably had planned. C takes d4, a takes b5. Black is still up a minor piece, 3 pieces to 2. But look what Anish can do here. Knight to c3. And after e takes d4, bishop takes d4. That's a really strong bishop. The knight's defended. The queen's ready to come into the game. And black's pieces are all looking a little bit uncoordinated back here. I think Anish wanted this position with a huge initiative. Queen d8 is the only move here. And now a move like knight d5 looks really strong. Knight takes, e takes, and the rook is coming into the attack. I don't think Magnus wanted any part of this position. So he probably realized this when he saw bishop to e3 and tried to think, is there a way that I could surprise Anish, who just surprised me? And after knight takes d4, a4, he plays this move knight takes b5, sacrificing the queen. We're only on move 8. After bishop takes b6, a takes b6. In this position, if you look at the Stockfish eval, white is up 1.9 here. White is almost up the equivalent of 2 pawns. But the thing that Magnus is so good at is he's able to take positions and say, okay, even though the engine may not say it's the best position for me, is it a position that's difficult to play for my opponent, or one that I feel that I can play for the win still in a practical game, Grandmaster against Grandmaster with no engines running? I think here he felt that with the minor pieces, that he had enough to play for a win still. Because if you look at the imbalances here, we have knight for knight. Black has 2 bishops and a knight for the queen, and the pawns are even. So it's 9 points to 9 points. Position's exactly even on material. But if those 3 pieces get coordinated into the game, it's much easier to play with the 3 pieces. So if you watch what happens here, Anish definitely starts playing with a sense of urgency. He knows he can't let those 3 minor pieces get active. So he plays knight to d2. First blunder. Queen to d3 was the better move according to the engine. As a way to kind of try to tie black down, this knight has to move, maybe queen g3, hitting this pawn, hitting the knight, right? This is making Magnus move the knight again. So this is the most accurate line according to Stockfish. But Anish played a natural looking move, knight to d2, trying to bring in the pieces, also threatening a takes b5 now that the queen guards the rook. So Magnus plays knight to d7. Looks like a funny move, but watch how Magnus gets these pieces developed in the next few moves. e5 by Anish. Stockfish is saying inaccuracy here. But it makes sense why Anish would do this. He's actually trying to come attack Magnus really quickly. He wants knight e4, f4, g4, f5. Try to attack that king before it has a chance to move. Knight d to f5 by Magnus, and knight to e4. Eyeing this hole, also keeping an eye on the f6 square, like if g6 is played. So Magnus has to figure out, how do I get that f8 bishop out? How do I get that c8 bishop out? And he calmly plays knight to c6, getting ready to bring this bishop out, eyeing the e5 pawn, even though he's probably not too interested in grabbing material right now. The main focus is, let's get all of these extra pieces into the game. Now Anish plays g4, another inaccuracy according to Stockfish. Knight to d6 check was best. So now the eval's about even. Magnus has gone from being down 1.9 to evening the score, and actually with Stockfish running a little bit deeper, even it's saying minus half a pawn. Knight to h4. Now Anish plays f4. Again, kind of playing with this sense of urgency, trying to quickly attack the black king, knowing that these pieces could come back into the game soon. And Magnus plays a really cool move here, h5. This is a way to activate the rook on the h file, and if you look coming up, he's going to activate the a rook down the a file. So Magnus is keeping the center of the board closed, keeping the king as safe as possible in the center, activating the rooks along the edges of the board. h3, we have this trade. Now we see d5 by Magnus. That's his attempt to get this last bishop into the game. Right, this dark bishop is already ready to move. d5 has to be played to get this bishop out. E takes d6, that's the strongest. And now look at this move, rook to a5. So even though Stockfish said maybe f5 was a little bit better, we see Magnus will find this idea on the very next move. c4, f5. So Magnus gambited a pawn, but he had this setup in mind. This bishop could maybe hide on d7, trying to shut down the white attack. And both rooks are going to come into the game very shortly and come after this white king with the knight in the area. So now there's a tough decision for Anish. You could take f5, but the rook is probably going to take back right away. So Anish decides, let's kick this rook first, drawing the knight away. And now he plays aggressive with pawn to d7 check. And I think, again, this is following the theme of the game. Anish is playing with a sense of urgency. He does not want those pieces for Magnus to get coordinated. So after bishop takes d7, knight d6 check, Magnus has to take or move the king up to e7, which would block in the bishop. And here Stockfish again is saying we're back to about even, and the knight's being attacked. So Anish gave those two pawns up to regain the initiative. He's been trying to get the initiative this whole game. And now here there's a really tough move to find for white. It's queen to c7. The reason queen to c7 is so good is because it's difficult for this black king to escape. There's no castling. Queen takes bishop. There's no king f7. Queen takes bishop. King to e7 allows rook a to d1. Creates a double attack. Black's still under a lot of pressure here. You almost have to play knight b8 according to the engine. And now these pieces are passive again. So queen c7, very strong move. But Anish plays, again, a move that looks very natural. And it's hard to say, like, does Magnus know that this is a blunder during the game? It's very possible. He's always looking for ways that his opponents could make mistakes. Rook a to d1 looks so natural. Why not bring the rook in, threaten the bishop, line him up on the open file? But look at this calm move by Magnus. It's the only move in the position. Bishop to c8. Knight guards d8, bishop guards d7, bishop guards e6. Now the king is ready to castle or play king f7. And black is getting to safety. Queen c7 now, and there's castling. And all of a sudden black has a 3-point advantage. All of these pieces are getting ready to come into the game for black. So very nice move, bishop to c8. Pawn to g5 by Anish. And now Magnus plays knight back to g7, opening up the rook down the h-file, but also he has this idea. It's kind of building a fortress, king f7, knight back to e7, and you can see how all of these pieces are very secure for black. And eventually he wants to push e5 and get that bishop into the game. So that's a lot of circles and a lot of arrows, but Magnus has a lot of pieces on the board, and he has this very nice plan to start to bring them into the game. So if you look at it from white's point of view, what's a good plan for white here? I think Anish has already had a bit of a loss. Rook to f2, but I mean, what else do you do? He's kind of just waiting for Magnus to show his hand. King f7, queen c7 check, and knight c to e7 blockading, and we're looking at a minus 3.3 advantage. So Magnus is essentially up a piece here, according to Stockfish. Anish plays rook to d8, offering a trade, which Magnus accepts, and now rook takes a4. So if you look at this position now, Anish only has 2 pieces left. Magnus has 4. The rook on f2 doesn't do anything, and everything is solid for black. How does Anish crack this structure? And this is all eventually going to fall. This pawn's going to fall, this pawn's going to fall. e5 could be played, the bishop comes into the game. So now after queen c7, we do see e5. And this is, again, very high level play. e5 is a pawn sacrifice, right? F takes e5. Why would you just sacrifice that pawn to bring in this last piece? And now look at this. We have rook takes c4 threatened. Every piece for black is well placed. There's this nice little fortress with the help of Anish's pawns. It's a very cozy home for the king. The white king is wide open, very exposed, and the queen and rook can't do anything to black's position. Queen takes b7, rook takes c4, queen takes b6. So now we're just focused on the king side, and you can just feel the power that black has with these extra 3 pieces. So 3 minor pieces for black against the queen, 2 pawns each, rook each. But it's a minus 3.7 advantage. So here goes the first pawn, knight takes e5. And after rook to e2, it looks like white's getting a little bit more play. But Magnus has this nice move, rook to c6, guarding the bishop. And Stockfish is even saying inaccuracy, but this is still well within winning territory. And after queen to e3, he brings that knight right back to the fortress position. So he grabbed the pawn, retreated the knight back. King h2, bishop c4, and now we start to see Magnus is getting active with these pieces. The bishop is eventually going to come onto this diagonal, but first this rook wants to get into the game. Rook to e4, looking at g4, h4, f4, take advantage of this open king. Rook to b7, and now we see Magnus securing the structure again, because the rook was pinning the knight, so queen takes f5 was a threat. But bishop e6 nicely defends it. And after king g1, we see rook to g4 check. Now the king can't go to the f-file, because rook f4, winning the queen. And after king h2, Magnus grabs the last white pawn. So now Magnus is up 2 pawns, 3 minors for the queen, and we're looking at a minus 4 Stockfish advantage. And here Anish makes another mistake, but I think if you let the computer run long enough, this is already completely winning. He plays rook to b6, and the problem is after bishop to d5, that bishop plus the rook create a really strong attack against the white king. So we see rook g2, rook back to g4, and if we check the threat, it's rook to h4 check. And if the king goes to g3, there's f4 fork. So Anish tries to get out of that. But now a pawn to f4 comes, and this pawn is coming up the board very quickly for a queen. And this is going to be how Magnus converts. Keep pushing that pawn up the board, and white's going to have a lot of trouble stopping it. So queen d4, if we look at the threat, there's nothing too dangerous. Rook to b4, rook to d6. So really no big threats here. Magnus plays rook to g5. So Stockfish is saying knight to h4 is the quicker win. For rook g5, still minus 7. After rook d6, we see f3, and now the plan is starting to happen. Let's keep pushing this pawn up the board. Rook to d7. Rook f5, putting the rook behind the pawn. Now it's ready to push. And again, no threats for white. Rook takes knight, queen takes bishop, none of them work. So Anish brings the queen over. Let's check for threats. threat is queen takes f5 check. So the knight is pinned, rook pins the knight, queen takes f5 check threatened. And look at this, bishop back to e6 with the tempo on the rook. Rook d1, and now he could play f2 here, but he starts with this nice move, knight to e5, hitting the queen. Queen moves. Stockfish says maybe queen e4 is more accurate, but it's still going to be a loss. Pawn to f2. Now the threat is f1 queen, and after king g2, bishop to d5 check. The only way that you kind of try to prove that king g2 was a useful move is to stick the king in front of the pawn, otherwise Magnus will just queen. But after bishop c4 check and f1 queen, the game is over. Anish resigns. So this was a great game. Jordan brought this up in the Chess Goals Discord and I just had to show it. Really beautiful play by Magnus, just going all the way back to this queen sacrifice. And the way that Magnus played for the initiative and to keep all of his pieces active, and the most important was keep his king safe. And you could tell the whole game Anish was kind of playing like he was afraid. He was afraid of those minor pieces getting coordinated, and for good reason. And I think even though we see the engine saying 1.9 here, this is a very good example of how we don't always want to trust the engine. Sometimes we need to find positions that are just easier to play. And I think Magnus, more than anyone, probably in the history of chess, has a very good sense for how easy and how hard positions are to play. And it's extra important now that we're in this computer era of chess, where the computers are so powerful, it's easy to just say like, oh, my opponent will never play knight takes b5 here because I'm +2. So you have to kind of develop that extra skill where you can look at an engine output but also say human versus human. Who's got the easier game here? Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed this game analysis. Anish Giri against Magnus Carlsen. Meltwater Champions Tour Finals. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this game. Do you want to see more game reviews? Stuff like that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.